10 lines in a row, and her influence was some of the desertscapes in the US. So very similar minimalist style, perhaps.
Yeah, no, she described herself as an abstract expressionist, and she was actually Canadian originally, but spent most of her life in the United States. But yeah, very well-known artist, Agnes, and very, very well respected. And I know that this particular work, certainly the artist concerned, Poppy, drew a lot of her inspiration from her work. So yes, like most art, it is slightly derivative.
Yeah, well, good on you, and all the very best. And by the way, finally, is that will it be up for sale?
No, the contest is acquisitive, so every year I get to keep the prize.
What? You get to keep it?
I get to keep the work. In return for the $25,000, I actually get to keep the work.
What sort of competition is this?
No, it is a competition. I mean, it's what they call an acquisitive prize. So basically, if you like, the price of the work suddenly becomes $25,000. Right.
Well, I'm kind of speechless, actually. I didn't expect that. But Chris, good on you, and happy collecting.
Thank you very much appreciated, and thank you for publicising us on your show.
It's actually, I do love that minimal feel, Wharamara, as you say. I mean, I don't know if the backslashes will work, but
I'll see if I can give it a go.
Yeah. All right, well, the Muppets, just on a final note, everyone has their favourite characters: Miss Piggy, Kermit, Fozzie Bear, Animal Beaker. These two were mine.
The question is, what is a phenomena?
The question is, who cares? He's doing it. He's eating a tire.
Amazing.
Astounding.
Boring.
She just vanished.
Statler and Waldorf, but after 65 years the Muppets came into being, they show no signs of leaving. They've had their ups and downs, the latest film to mild reviews, but the Muppets are still here. And I wanted to go around the panel and see, what do you think the enduring appeal is of the Muppets, and was there a favourite, Wharamara?
I think I have the same question. I've always found them just slightly disturbing. Not a fan.
Not a fan? Not quite there with the Muppets?
Nope.
No.
Not at all.
What do you reckon, Peter? Do you have any theories on why the Muppets?
I enjoyed the Muppets. I think that they're anarchic and crazy and mad and totally irreverent. And your two favourites were my two. I used to enjoy those two old grumpy guys in the stalls offering their views. It's just all sort of madcap stuff. The amazing thing for me is that the Americans could do it, because that's normally a much more British style of humour.
Right, yeah. The Swedish Chef, you also had Beaker, Miss Piggy. I mean, a clarion call of wonderful characters. But what was it about those two, Statler and Waldorf, Peter, that really did it for me? Two grumpy old men watching a show.
Yeah, I think for me it was the fact that we all knew someone like that.
Very good. Yes, indeed. Peter Dunn and Wharamara Bar, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks
really do appreciate
it.
Wallace Chapman, I'll be back tomorrow from 3:45. See you then. Meanwhile, Checkpoint is up. Stay tuned.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E Haere nei, an independent report raises serious concerns about a lack of accountability and transparency around billions of dollars in Provincial Growth Fund spending. So how are projects being chosen, and are they value for money? Should the mental health of returned travellers be assessed before they're put into managed isolation or quarantine? The first woman to escape from a managed isolation hotel gets a 6-month suspended sentence. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield joins us. Government funding for fresh fruit and veggies to hungry whānau is running out, but food banks say demand is growing. They knocked, but nobody was home. 800 people with COVID-19 or waiting on test results were out and about in Victoria when authorities came calling.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Auditor General says the $3 billion Provincial Growth Fund needs to be more transparent about how it operates. That's one of 3 recommendations in a report released today. But the Minister in charge of the fund, Shane Jones, says he's seen no evidence officials haven't been open about how the money's being spent. Mr Jones doesn't agree with other findings in the report. He utterly rejects the PGF has been tainted by unmanaged conflicts of interest, and in his mind, transparency problems don't exist.
Any notion that the Provincial Growth Fund decisions and allocations have been surrounded by fog, I've seen no evidence of that.
Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones. The lawyer appealing a decision to ban the provocative Canadian speakers Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux from Auckland Council venues says the appellants would even defend the rights of neo-Nazis to speak. The case was thrown out by the High Court, but the Court of Appeal is today being asked to consider whether the council overstepped the mark when it cancelled the event. Justice Koch asked Jack Hodder, the lawyer for the 2 men, how far they'd go to defend freedom of speech.
We're not quite at the level of a neo-Nazi organisation cheerfully booking the Bruce Mason Centre, but perhaps even then.
We would say even then, probably. Unless those who are organising and performing at the meeting were advocating something unlawful, then all the ordinary aspects of these debates come to bear.
Jack Hodder QC. The Ministry of Health has offered support to Victoria as it grapples with the resurgence of COVID-19. The Australian state has recorded another 439 new cases and 11 more deaths in the last 24 hours. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says his ministry has offered both governmental and professional support.
It's not that we've got necessarily advice that they might be able to use, but it's probably just to be part of their assurance mechanism if they want to test things with us. In particular because we have had that experience of going into a very strict lockdown and how that worked, and so we stand ready to provide any support. We've had a really good working relationship with Australia right from the start of this, and that continues.
Dr Ashley Bloomfield says so far the ministry hasn't been asked for any help from Victoria. You can hear the full interview with him on Checkpoint shortly. New Zealand exporters could be facing a shortage of ways to get their goods to overseas markets in a cargo crunch. Auckland Airport has revealed it is worried about the state of air cargo capacity as borders remain closed for the global COVID-19 pandemic. About 80% of New Zealand's air cargo arrives and leaves in the bellies of passenger planes. But with few planes arriving or departing, that is now a problem. The airport's latest air cargo data revealed to RNZ today shows available capacity has dropped away faster than the demand. There's more on this story on Checkpoint Business. The Union of Senior Doctors says the resignation of Canterbury's DHB Chief Executive is a disaster for public health. David Mates has resigned after 11 years dominated by rebuilding Christchurch Hospital after the 2011 earthquake. The board says Mr Mates led the organisation through challenging times. However, the head of the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists says the board has forced him out. Sarah Dalton says senior clinicians backed him. The government is giving the most severely disabled children more teacher aid hours from the start of the next school term. The Associate Education Minister, Tracy Martin, says it will be spending an extra $126 million over 4 years to give children with high and very high needs an average 3 more hours of help each week. She says the government has allocated a further $31 million to high-need children who need extra help to return to school because of the pandemic. The funding is for ongoing resourcing scheme, which provides help for children with significant disabilities. It's 4 minutes past 5. The Warriors are adamant they won't be rushed into hiring a new head coach for the NRL side. Another potential candidate is no longer in the mix, with interim coach Todd Payton turning down an offer to take the job on a permanent basis. The club has been searching for a full-time replacement since they sacked Stephen Kearney 6 weeks ago, and Warriors players are among those calling for the process to be wrapped up as soon as possible. But in the wake of Payton's revelation, Chief Executive Cameron George says they're committed to taking their time.
If it's in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it could be if it's in 3 months. It doesn't worry us. We've got some great skilled coaches that sit here internally that we can continue to utilise. We've got to weigh up and get clarity on a number of issues, and we're happy to take our time to get that clarity before we make an appointment.
Cameron George also confirmed the Warriors had granted playmaker Blake Green an immediate release to join the Newcastle Knights. Kiwi golf caddy Steve Williams believes the absence of fans will present an obstacle for his former boss Tiger Woods at the upcoming US PGA Championships. The American star resumes his chase of Jack Nicklaus' record 18 major wins when the sport's first major of the year starts in San Francisco on Friday. On the bag for 13 of Woods' 15 major victories, Williams says Woods' lack of tournament play this year will make it challenging to find the spark he needs. That's the news.
Colourful language.
That I've acquitted myself to the best of my ability in being quite a cool and a colourful steward of the Provincial Growth Fund.
Technological language.
Basically, TikTok is just this sort of geopolitical pinata at this point.
And the language of art.
It was also about sort of an abstract landscape. Quite a personal piece, so I can see how it wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea or everyone's view of art.
Your Language. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Gisborne, long fine spells. Isolated showers mainly in the east. Auckland to Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. Also Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Mainly fine with areas of evening and morning fog. Cloud gradually increasing tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast and Wellington, cloudy periods. Patchy drizzle tonight and tomorrow morning. For Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury and Otago, mainly fine with high cloud. However, areas of low cloud or fog developing tomorrow. Bulla, mostly cloudy with a few showers. Westland and Fiordland, occasional rain, clearing from Fiordland tomorrow. Southland, mostly cloudy, patchy rain developing this afternoon, clearing tomorrow morning. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. It is impossible to tell if hundreds of millions of dollars in Provincial Growth Fund spending is value for taxpayer money, according to the Auditor General. John Ryan's report, released today, raises concerns about a lack of transparency around how some of the $3 billion has been allocated and the establishment of a so-called fund within a fund that seemed to have different criteria applied to it. It also found projects had been tagged for funding before due diligence was complete, and it was difficult to assess the value of the jobs created. The report says evaluation is critical given the fund's ambition, size and profile, and the public is entitled to know how well the PGF has met its objectives and what benefits it's delivered. Auditor General John Ryan says even though the Provincial Growth Fund is a work in progress, there are some areas that still concern him.
There is some reporting of funds that have been given out to different projects. There is some reporting about jobs, although we've commented in the report that that's a very difficult number to verify, and to see whether it actually meets the requirements of the fund. So what we are expecting is that there's much clearer reporting consolidated across the fund about what was expected, where we're out against that, and what's been achieved.
So just to be clear, it's not possible to tell whether it is succeeded in good returns on investment, whether it has met its objectives of creating high-quality, sustainable jobs and also enabling, Māori to realise their aspirations. Those are some of the core goals set out for this particular fund. So based on the information that is available now, it's not possible to tell whether it's a success in those areas.
Yeah, what we say in the report is that obviously the fund is still work in progress. All the money hasn't yet been allocated and it certainly hasn't yet been spent either. What we're expecting at this stage is to be able to see all the projects that were funded, what was expected of each of those projects and what's been achieved against that expectation. But ultimately what we need to know is whether there's value for money in $3 billion of public spending, and the plan needs to be in place to evaluate that now.
So we don't know yet whether it's a good investment of the $3 billion.
We don't know yet, but I don't think we can expect to know yet. I think what we can expect to know is how the progress towards the goals of the fund are going, and that's not yet clear.
Okay, so for example, today the Minister Shane Jones released information suggesting that more than 13,000 people are employed in PGF-related jobs. Can we tell how accurate that is?
I haven't looked at announcements today from Minister Jones. The reporting that the fund has been doing on jobs has been collected from applicants. We comment in our report that it's a difficult number to measure. Full-time, part-time, whether they're high-school jobs, whether they're sustainable jobs. That's not obvious from the reporting to date.
So it's not possible at this point in time to break down the quality of jobs nor how many have been created from the information that was available to you?
I think we see the reporting that the PDU, the Provincial Development Unit within MB, is doing on jobs. That's collected and reported. That's one measure. I guess what we're saying in the report is that it's a very difficult number to measure, and while there is some reporting, it doesn't give quality of job, it doesn't give skill level, it doesn't give sustainability.
So in your view, in that area, does it fall well short of what your expectation would be?
Across all areas, I think we would want to have seen better reporting against what the fund was set up to do, and a collective reporting against all the objectives of the fund at this point. But the other point we make is actually the fund isn't due to be evaluated yet, although that's shortly to start. We want to see a plan for the evaluation, which I think will ultimately answer the value for money question, which $3 billion should be able to be answered.
Okay, well, on that subject of evaluation, there was supposed to be an evaluation by the end of 2020, and I see in your report that has been postponed until mid-2021. Is that acceptable? People are going to be voting in an election shortly. Is it acceptable for that report to be put off for a significant period of time?
So I know that the Provincial Development Unit is working on their evaluation plan. We had expected that might have been further developed by now, but I do recognise in the report that COVID has diverted attention and activity in the fund, and also obviously interrupted much of the work that was being done. So I think they've reset that timeline. The point that we really make is that to do a good evaluation, you need to be thinking about that right from the start in terms of the contracts you let, the information you gather, and we would have hoped that work would have been done by now.
So what, poor planning?
No, the fund initially was required to evaluate by Cabinet in 2020. I guess when the fund was set up and when initial contracts were let, some of the thinking about evaluation may not have been front and centre in their minds, but we'd expect that to be in place by now, and that's one of the recommendations we make in the report.
You discuss in the report the fact that approximately $70 million was set aside for so-called manifesto commitments, and that was handed out for certain projects. What problem do you have with that money being ring-fenced in that manner?
I highlight that in the report. It's $70 million that was described as for manifesto commitments or emerging priorities. It wasn't clear to us how you might apply to be considered as that part of the fund. It wasn't clear how those projects were assessed against the criteria for the rest of the PGF, and in fact whether they actually met the normal criteria that would be required for projects to be funded. And the last element that I think separated it from the rest of the fund was that normally officials would recommend to ministers whether the project should be approved based on their assessments. For those projects, there was no recommendation made.
Sorry to interrupt, but so were they just picking favourites?
I don't conclude on whether they're picking favourites or not. I point out that if there is parts of the fund that are managed in a different way, then they actually need to be transparent with that. That's $70 million of taxpayers' money, and I think all spending should be transparent about how decisions are made about it and what it's spent on.
And that is the Auditor General, John Ryan. The Minister in charge of the Provincial Growth Fund, Shane Jones, told our reporter Joe Moyer he's seen no evidence officials haven't been transparent about the money being spent.
Any notion that the Provincial Growth Fund decisions and allocations have been surrounded by fog, I've seen no evidence of that.
And the Minister will join us after the 6 o'clock news. It is almost 15 minutes past 5. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. There are questions about mental health care for those in managed isolation and quarantine following the sentencing of the first person to flee such a facility today. Suzanne Marie Derrett was showing signs of emotional distress on the night she fled from Auckland's Pullman Hotel, only halfway through her required isolation period. Today she was denied diversion and handed down a 6-month suspended sentence. Our Otago Southland reporter Timothy Brown was in the Dunedin District Court for today's sentencing, and he filed this report.
On July the 4th, only a week after Susan Derrett returned to New Zealand from Brisbane, the 43-year-old was clearly agitated. She was yelling gibberish, talking to herself and a wall, and yelled at staff at the Pullman Hotel. Minutes later, she leapt over a 5-foot-tall brick wall and fled. Mental Health Foundation Chief Executive Sean Robinson says those in charge of managed isolation have a responsibility for those staying there.
There is a duty of care to make sure that people are being checked on, that their state of mind and their just kind of how they are, how they're coping is being checked on, and that they are given appropriate support.
Susan Derrett had a history of mental health issues before she arrived in managed isolation. She suffered from depression, anxiety and substance abuse. But that wasn't known by those in charge, and she received no specific care, which Judge Kevin Phillips characterised during this morning's sentencing as a major failing. Mr Robinson says it emphasises the need for good pastoral care of all those in managed isolation and quarantine.
I'm not suggesting that we need to do a psychiatric assessment of every person that is coming back to New Zealand. But hopefully, if there's good sort of ongoing kind of pastoral care, really, of the people who are in isolation, then people who are starting to become, quite distressed can be identified quite quickly and additional support put in place.
Judge Kevin Phillips said he's confident Derrett's behaviour is entirely as a result of her mental health difficulties. But she now has a conviction, and if she reoffends in any way in the next 6 months, she'll be recalled to be resentenced. He also questioned why police would not grant diversion, considering her mental health struggles and lack of criminal history. The police prosecutor says it was referred to Police National Headquarters and was decided against. Judge Phillips saw that as police deciding it was too hard and throwing it back to the courts. The Minister in charge of Managed Isolation Facilities, Megan Woods, says the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment is continuing to work with the Ministry of Health to improve the care of those in isolation. She says everyone receives a preliminary health check, which includes mental health and well-being.
But look, there is no playbook for this. We've never quarantined tens of thousands of people at our border before. So we're operating on a model of continuous improvement, and we continue to work to see what further support we need to put in place to support people.
The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, says whatever services are needed by those in isolation are available.
There are health staff on site 24/7, of course, and my sense is, again, having visited facilities, all the staff, not just the health staff, are very committed to looking after the well-being of both mental and physical well-being of the people who are there, and go out of their way to ensure that any support that is required is the need for support is identified and then the support is made available.
Dr Bloomfield says one of the reasons why Auckland DHB is now in charge of oversight of the health services within managed isolation in the region is because they can quickly draw on whatever specialist services are needed, including mental health. Derrett had returned negative tests for COVID-19 on day 3 and 12 of her isolation period. In Dunedin, for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
Daily testing rates for COVID-19 are falling well short of the Ministry of Health's own targets. Yesterday, 1,608 tests were completed, with a 7-day rolling average of 2,348. Both are well short of the 4,000 a day the Director General of Health estimates is optimal. And while there is currently no evidence of community transmission in New Zealand, Dr Ashley Bloomfield says if there are new cases, the threshold to recommend lockdown restrictions will be low. I asked the Director General of Health a little earlier about Suzanne Derrett's case, and the judge's concerns a lack of mental health screening at the facility was a major failing.
Everyone going into managed isolation, as they go in, does have a full assessment, and that includes any mental health needs now. And that also that if those needs are identified either when they go in or during their stay there, we have got trained staff who can help, both the nursing and other health staff who are there on a 24/7 basis, but also they can call up and get support from specialist mental health services. So I think that area has been greatly strengthened.
So what is on offer in terms of proactive, routine mental health screening as people come into isolation?
Well, they're asked about any needs they have, including physical or mental health needs, and those are assessed by the nurses. And if they're found to have needs right there at entry, then specialist services can be brought on board. There are also daily check-ins, of course, by the nursing staff and other staff. And if any new needs emerge during the stay, then specialist services can be called on.
Is there any thought to reviewing those, given this case and the judge's comments?
Well, what I can say is we're actually constantly reviewing all aspects of the health and other services that are provided to people. For example, we audit the infection prevention and control. We will, of course, take a very good look at what the judge has found and make sure that those services that might be needed are readily available and that it is clear to people how to reach out and get help if they need it.
If we can just look at Australia for a moment, lots of people will be watching that situation unfold with horror. And it reminds us of our tight lockdown here. So if at any point we get community transmission again in New Zealand, do we go straight to level 4 lockdown?
Well, the decision about a lockdown or moving up the levels is with Cabinet. Of course, our mainstay is to identify early if we've got any cases of community transmission so that we can actually put in place measures to ring-fence, contact trace and isolate people without having to go into a lockdown situation. So that's why we've used the time over the last few months to absolutely strengthen that national contact tracing capability and capacity. But what it does show that actually if you're going to implement measures that put restrictions on people's movement, then the time to do that is early on, and I know that there will be a low threshold for us providing advice, and I suspect for Cabinet to make decisions about any restrictions, whether those are local or more wide.
So what's your tipping point then? When you say there would be a low threshold, you are the advisor, so at what point would you advise taking away those freedoms going into a lockdown?
Well, it very much depends on the individual situation, and that's what was what happened last time. I think one of the things we do have to be sort of aware of is that we're in an alert level 1 type arrangement, so Kiwis are moving all around the country. And as we've found, for example, with the contact tracing we've done on the people who might have been where the chap who's turned up in South Korea, and there's been a woman who's turned up in Australia who have tested positive, we're not sure that they were either infected or infectious here, but we've done quite wide contact tracing. And in the case of the South Korean person in that investigation, that's involved Auckland, Christchurch and Queenstown. We haven't hesitated to do that, but what it does show is if we do get a case, it may well be someone has been, more than just in their local area, and so the contact tracing and the follow-up would need to happen across the country.
So community transmission doesn't necessarily mean restricted movement, or does it?
It doesn't necessarily mean, because the idea here is that we implement immediate processes around contact tracing, self-isolation and testing of potential close and casual contacts. And the whole aim of doing that early and of really scaling up our contact tracing capability is to avoid putting restrictions on movement. So saying, we won't hesitate to provide advice if we think that's what's needed to actually contain things. What we've seen, of course, if you contrast New South Wales with Victoria, is they have deployed that very rapid testing, contact tracing, and so far much lower numbers of cases, and they haven't had to put any restrictions on movement, even though they've got cases each day.
Keeping track of what's going on is largely due to testing numbers, and the Health Minister has said, well, we're still not there yet in terms of the numbers of tests we're doing. I think it was about, 1,608 people tested yesterday. Where's the sweet spot? How many do we need to be testing every day?
Well, we've had a look at this, and we think it depends partly on the number of people in managed isolation facilities. And over the last few weeks, because the airlines sort of stopped the flights coming in, our managed isolation facilities have only been at about 50 to 60% capacity. So that's reduced the numbers of tests of people being tested there. We have seen an increase over the last couple of weeks in people being tested in the community. We would like more, and I guess our aim is to have everybody who is symptomatic be tested. And also we will be doing, as we are today in Queenstown, these pop-up approaches where we want to do wider community surveillance, including of people who may not have symptoms, but where we're just wanting to be sure there's no community transmission.
Can you put a number on it, though, Dr. Bloomfield?
Well, in total, if we add all those up, we think around 4,000, if that includes our community testing, plus our day 3 and day 12 testing and managed isolation, plus our testing of people who work around the border and in those managed isolation facilities.
So you're way off.
Yep. Well, as I say, part of that is due to the lower numbers in managed isolation and quarantine. But we do know the numbers in the community has been low. We know people have been declining testing, and that's why we really have put a focused effort on that. And we've seen those numbers start to increase over the last week or two. We're wanting them to go higher, and we're also wanting to supplement that with these pop-ups. The one in Queenstown today is going very well. The last report I had around sort of 1:30 was that had 600 people through already.
I understand that you have offered assistance to Australia, in particular to Victoria. Have they taken you up on that?
Not at this stage, but in particular what we were wanting to do was, it's not that we've got necessarily advice on what they might be able to use, but it's probably just to be part of their assurance mechanism if they want to test things with us, in particular because we have had that experience of going into a very strict lockdown and how that worked, and so we stand ready to provide any support. We've had a really good working relationship with Australia right from the start of this, and that continues.
What would you be doing in Victoria right now?
I would be doing exactly what they are doing, and that is, really enforcing a very strict lockdown. We know that works here, and I suspect they have looked to what worked in New Zealand, and that has helped inform what they're doing now.
But would you have done it sooner?
Oh, look, I don't want to comment on that. You have to respond to what you're seeing on the ground, and of course it's not something you can just do. You have to bring people with you. I think they've reached that conclusion, and I think that, they're confident that once they enforce a strict lockdown, that they will get the result they need, which is to break the chain of community transmission.
And do you think it is strict enough right now?
From my reading of it, I think it is, but I know they'll be pulling out all stops to make sure that they achieve what they want to achieve.
And that was our Director-General of Health, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield. The Victorian Government has brought in strict new penalties for those breaching home isolation rules as the state prepares for a tough Level 4 business shutdown tomorrow night. A curfew is already in place with metropolitan Melburnians restricted to their properties from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. But many are worried if those who own or work in small businesses will survive the 6-week ordeal. Alex Perrottet reports.
More cases, more deaths. Today, the death toll in Victoria reaching 147, and amid the criticism of how it's handling the crisis, the state government again sending clear warnings it will punish people who disobey the lockdown. Dan Andrews will slap an almost $5,000 fine on people not found at home when they should be self-isolating, and they can no longer leave their premises for exercise. And he's sending out fresh troops to knock on doors. Literally, 500 more Defence Force personnel and 300 more health officers.
There will be multiple door knocks and they will be random in nature, as well as all close contacts will also be visited on the same basis. And those door knocks, you are expected to be found at home.
Melburnians haven't exactly been following the rules. Out of 3,000 door knocks so far, 800 people who should have been at home self-isolating were not. From tomorrow, many others will be forced to stay at home as their workplaces shut up shop. Robert Dugdale is lucky though, as he works in a book distribution business which can continue operating as there's fewer than 5 people in the warehouse, but he says many friends and neighbours will struggle.
It's really tough. Some of these people have families and mortgages and they are not able to work, and in a lot of cases they've been indefinitely laid off or made redundant. So that's, it's really difficult.
He says he's not hoarding, but certainly thinking about what the family will need for the next 6 weeks.
We're mainly thinking about food. Meat is in shortage here because some of the abattoirs have had outbreaks. So meat's pretty scarce at the moment, and there's been, the normal hoarding that we saw after the first round of lockdowns.
But federal MP Tim Wilson, who's locked down in his seat of Goldstein in inner Melbourne, says meat should be in supply.
So apparently going to be reduced in their capacity, so that's not illogically sprung people to think there might be meat shortages and the like. I don't think that's going to occur because we still have the rest of the nation to support us, but people are nervous.
Tim Wilson says people weren't panic buying, but there's stress and fears.
I think there's a fair bit of anger and frustration, particularly for a lot of small business people and a lot of people who are losing work and employment. And so everybody's frankly just running around trying to sort out their lives for the next 6 weeks when they'll be severely constrained in what they can do.
Apart from the new fines for breaching isolation, there's still a $200 fine for not wearing a mask in public. Marissa Garrett is 38 weeks pregnant and living in the northern town of Wodonga, which is mostly locked off from Albury across the New South Wales border. Her doctor and birthing unit are there, and she'll need to make a swift trip across any day now. But she'll have to wait in the queue with everyone else and show her permit and driver's licence.
The longest we've had to wait is probably half an hour sometimes, but most of the time it's smooth sailing, like maybe 15 minutes tops. But when the borders first closed down, I heard it was a nightmare. It was like some people were waiting like 3 hours.
Marissa says the mask-wearing rule is over the top, and even nurses have told her it's ridiculous.
Which is amazing, because I thought, like more nurses would be like, we got to comply. But some people are like, this is ridiculous. I'm a healthy individual. I don't need a mask. I think a lot of us are just sick of this, because what's the point of having a mask? I don't want it to ever become like an accessory, like a shirt and trousers and shoes. Oh, and a mask. It's like, this is ridiculous.
But Katie Lee, a mother of 8 living in Albury, says she's happy to wear the mask, even if it's just for solidarity's sake.
Whether it's necessary or not, I feel I have a social responsibility to cooperate. And I think if I can just do my bit, then I'm participating in moving forward. And there has been a lot of mixed messages. We were told earlier on masks are not helpful. So then to be told, well, actually, let's wear masks can be confusing.
Tim Wilson agrees with the stiff penalties for that minority who flout the rules, but also points the finger of blame at Dan Andrews and his government for not embracing the federal government's contact tracing app.
We have an app which lots of countries have, which have enabled people to help with the tracing system. The Victorian government hasn't been as enthusiastic to use it, whereas New South Wales has been in identifying gaps.
He says although the state government hasn't taken up New Zealand's offer for help and advice, they can and should get any help they need. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, hundreds of people queue for a free COVID test in Queenstown today. The Christchurch gunman racks up a $3 million prison bill. Ian Lees-Galloway gives his valedictory speech and apologises to his family, and why TikTok could become part of Microsoft's empire in a matter of weeks. We would love your feedback. Should mental health assessments take place before returned travellers go into managed isolation? Let us know your thoughts. Also interested in hearing from you on the Provincial Growth Fund. Do you think it's money well spent, or do we need a bit more detail before we decide if it is? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email us. The address there is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time now for the headlines with Susanna.
The Auditor General has told Checkpoint it's impossible to tell if hundreds of millions of dollars in Provincial Growth Fund spending is value for taxpayer money. John Ryan's report released today raises concerns about a lack of transparency around how some of the $3 billion has been allocated and the establishment of a so-called fund within a fund. The Director General of Health has admitted the ministry is falling well short of its COVID-19 testing targets. Just over 1,600 people tested for the coronavirus yesterday, but he feels that figure should be closer to 4,000. Ashley Bloomfield told Checkpoint, however, the numbers are increasing after a focused effort on the Health Ministry to encourage the public to get tested. A free drive-through testing site in Queenstown Lakes has been overwhelmed with people wanting to get tested after a traveller visited the district who was then diagnosed with COVID-19 in South Korea. The site at the Pack and Save car park in Frankton had to get an extra 500 tests to cope with the demand by mid-morning. The government's putting pressure on local councils to accept its money to fix New Zealand's three waters problem. Today, the Minister for Local Government announced the share of $761 million between regions for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. Hurricane Isaias has made landfall in the US states of North and South Carolina, with storm surges and winds of up to 140 kilometres an hour. Isaias was classified a tropical storm when it hit islands in the Caribbean and caused the death of 2 people, but was recently upgraded back to a hurricane. The disgraced former Minister Ian Lees-Galloway says he had no choice but to leave politics after having an inappropriate relationship with a former staffer. In his final farewell speech in the debating chamber, the Palmerston North MP told the House some of his behaviour has not met expectations. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. And this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Video sharing platform TikTok could become part of Microsoft's empire in a matter of weeks after a political ultimatum from Donald Trump. The US president has warned he will ban the Chinese-owned company unless a sale goes ahead by mid-September because of fears user data could be used by the Chinese government. However, New Zealand TikTok users aren't fussed and say the whole issue has become too political. Here's Jonathan Mitchell.
Auckland pop sensation Benny's Super Lonely track has taken the world by storm and become a viral hit on TikTok.
I'm just a loser, shouldn't be with ya.
And South Auckland high school student Josh685 has also been riding the TikTok wave. His breakout single Laxed Siren Beat has also gone viral.
Savage love, did somebody break your heart?
And it even has some local political fans.
I deleted Twitter because I don't have time to be on Twitter. I tell you what, I've got a cousin who's on TikTok. Man, is she good. My cousin Cindy, she's amazing.
Because I'm on Twitter.
I think I'm too old to work it out.
Isn't that what clocks do?
No.
I feel like I'm too old for it. No, I'm obviously familiar with it. I've featured a couple of times in other people's TikTok, but I do not have it on my phone.
TikTok has become a political issue in the United States. For months now, the White House has been warning that the private information of American users is exposed to China's communist government. Both Beijing and TikTok deny that. However, President Donald Trump has set a time limit on a sale with Microsoft.
I set a date of around September 15th, at which point it's going to be out of business in the United States. But if somebody, and whether it's Microsoft or somebody else buys it, that'll be interesting.
TikTok is reportedly worth around $50 billion, and President Trump wants a share of that.
Without us, I use the expression, it's like the landlord and the tenant. And without the lease, the tenant doesn't have the value. Well, we're sort of, in a certain way, the lease. We make it possible to have this great success. TikTok's a tremendous success, but a big portion of it's in this country.
The Chinese government is far from impressed by all this, accusing the US of double standards and discriminating against Chinese companies. This voice of a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has been translated.
The US has been stretching the concept of national security without any evidence and only based on a presumption of guilt. It is threatening certain businesses. It goes against market economy principles and has exposed its hypocrisy in so-called upholding fairness and freedoms.
Auckland TikTok user Mikalia Mackey says the ownership won't affect her use of the app.
It's just a good time passer, I guess, in between studying. Yeah. I did see that Donald Trump said he was going to ban it or Microsoft were going to buy it. My view on it is it's around Chinese censorship and them gathering information from America and any other users that use it, which I understand, but I think that in such a globalized world where everyone's all on the same social network, it is kind of difficult to actually control that.
Adam Ishikawa isn't on the app but says the whole issue is too political.
Facebook, as you may be aware, they're no different as well. They sell people's privacy online. I think the US is over-concerned. Just leave it as it is.
An Auckland woman agrees most social media companies are the same, but points out Facebook is banned in China.
Whether you use Instagram, Facebook, TikTok or whatever, they're just going to get your personal details regardless. They listen to you on your phone and then they give you adverts as to what you've been Googling or searching or talking about with your family. I think it's another one of Trump's little scams.
Hannah Filmer has watched a few TikTok videos and made a couple herself during lockdown.
Maybe the US is taking things a bit far. They already have all of, the bigger companies. Possibly they could just be a bit more sort of like neutral about everything and sort of just like leave it for what the people decide they want.
A technology commentator says Donald Trump's concerns about the app are as valid as his fears about immigrants flooding in from Mexico. But Vaughan Davis says everyone should be concerned about giving their personal information to a digital platform, whether it's Microsoft, Facebook, Apple or TikTok.
But that level of concern, I think, is a matter of, it's a personal decision. We share this information in exchange for a free digital service, and we do that with eyes wide open. And if we think it's worth the exchange, we go ahead and do it.
Other commentators say users don't need to panic and remove themselves from the app following President Trump's comments. But with the clock now ticking, the deadline of a sale by mid-September is fast approaching. For Checkpoint, call Jonathan Mitchell, 10:08.
Right, it's time for business news now with Nicholas Poynton. I feel like you should be cracking out a few TikTok moves for us, Nicholas. Have you got it on your phone?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
OK, all right, let's move on then to the real business news. New Zealand exporters could be facing a shortage of ways to get their goods to overseas markets. What they're calling it a cargo crunch. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is going to be quite the worry for exporters going forward. So today, not too long ago, really, the Auckland Airport has released its international cargo data for the half year ended June. And what it tells us is demand is down, but capacity is actually down further. And now we're in a situation that's been going on for a while now where demand is actually outstripping supply. And this decline is largely attributable to the fact that we don't really have passenger flights as much as anywhere like we used to. And typically about 80% of the country's cargo is transported in the belly of passenger flights. Yeah. So the government, a while back, the government did step in. They said they're going to help out. They're going to help subsidise the air cargo market. But that's due to end in August. And Auckland Airport has pointed out that, the actual peak export volume season is actually from October to January. And this is also in line when a lot of fresh food producers will be looking to send their goods, their high-value goods, overseas. And the airport says, look, unless these borders are opened, unless there's an increase in cargo-only flights, there is going to be a shortage of capacity. And look, we talk a lot about, when the wage subsidy scheme ends. Look, this is another scheme where we're going to have to keep a really close eye on going forward to see if there's any other announcements from the government about maybe extending this going forward. Because after speaking to Auckland Airport today, this seems to be something that is definitely on the boil and it will have to be addressed at some point. Because you can imagine, I haven't had the opportunity to speak to exporters, but this will be something going forward where there will want to be a degree of certainty.
Yeah, because I think that original funding from the government was something like $330 million, and a significant amount of the contract went to Air New Zealand. So I'm sure they'll be curious about whether there's additional money as well. Okay, so car sales. Now, this I find really interesting and, slightly weird. So they're up on last year, car sales, which is interesting when we have rising unemployment. I mean, what's driving the surge?
Yeah, so new vehicle registrations for July were up by 3.1% on the year earlier. And that's the first time car sales have actually jumped up above where they were last year since we went into lockdown. I spoke to the motor industry today. They were surprised by this themselves. They say this is largely, this wasn't anticipated at all, because given that, new vehicle registrations in April were down 90% on where they were a year earlier. So after speaking to the industry, they say, look, they've spoke to their members, and what they're saying is, on one hand, you have a large number of people, they're returning from overseas, some of them are cashed up, and they need to buy cars. And on the other, and this is you have to bear in mind, this is what the industry is saying. This took me by surprise. They say June and July, they're typically strong months for international tourism. This is a time of year when a lot of people are going overseas. I was supposed to be one of these people, European summers, the whole shebang. And they're saying that these people, look, they've got this disposable income. They were looking for places to spend it, and one of the places they're spending it on are new cars. So look, it comes as a bit of a surprise, but after speaking to the industry, they say that overall car sales for the year, new car sales for the year, are actually down by 25% on where they were last year, and they expect this to continue for the rest of the year. So read between the lines, they're saying that, look, this is a bump, it's well welcome, but they do not really expect it to continue from here on in, and this is with the wage subsidy coming to an end later in the end of August.
Yeah, it's interesting interesting because we seem to forget that more than 30,000 people have come through managed isolation and quarantine. That's the size of a large town.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. Okay, what else has been going on in the markets today, Nicholas?
So the NZX Top 50 is up nearly 1% by 105 points to 11,771. The New Zealand dollar is steady at 66.1 US cents, 92.7 Australian, and unchanged at 50.7 British pence.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business update. The eye-watering cost of keeping the Christchurch mosque gunman behind bars has reignited calls for him to be sent back to Australia to serve his sentence there. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
The most reviled man in New Zealand, racking up an almighty bill behind bars. Newly released cabinet papers show more than $3.5 million was put aside for the first 2 years of Brenton Tarrant's incarceration. The gunman who killed 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, costing the country almost $5,000 a day.
It's mind-boggling, actually, and I cannot think it's justified.
$5,000 a day is a lot of bread and water. I'd rather see us economise on that asshole's accommodation.
The eye-watering sum bringing 2 political foes together, Winston Peters and David Seymour, on the same page. The cost is far too high. It's more than 16 times the average cost of an average prisoner.
He is locked up in our prisons and the cost is what the cost is.
And the cost is for good reason, according to the Corrections Minister, Calvin Davis. A high-profile, high-risk prisoner demands high security. That risk on display last year when the gunman was able to send hateful letters from within his cell.
What I can say is he's been kept in accordance with the Corrections Act and our international obligations, but for operational security reasons I really can't go into any further detail.
The extraordinary price tag, though, has ignited calls for the terrorist to be shipped back to his home country, Australia, to serve his sentence there.
I think he should go back, yes.
New Zealand First's leader, Winston Peters, also the Foreign Minister, says it would be the honourable thing for Australia to take the man back.
If there's an agreement between the Australian government and New Zealand government, it's very simple to do.
But securing that sort of agreement is perhaps less simple. It would likely require a law change in both countries. And as the opposition points out, hundreds of Kiwis are serving their sentences across the ditch, and New Zealand hardly wants to see them flying back en masse. National's Judith Collins says the gunman must stay.
He committed his evil crime here. I think he needs to have his sentence here, even though it costs us a lot of money. The fact is, it's the rule of law, and we don't ask other people to take over and to pay for or have our sentences.
Still, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is staying open to the possibility of sending Tarrant back, though she says the cost would not be a factor in any decision. She says first and foremost, the victims would have to be consulted.
It is a very different set of circumstances. That's why we've never taken it off the table, but we do need to make sure that justice is done here first. We haven't had the sentencing yet. We need to see that through. Prime Minister, have you...
Tarrant's sentencing is scheduled to begin later this month. He's expected to spend the rest of his life behind bars, whatever country that may be in. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
It is 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The trial of a former school teacher accused of abusing teenage boys has now heard from 2 of the boys at the centre of the case. Benjamin Swan is on trial in the High Court at Auckland for the next 3 weeks, accused of sexually assaulting 6 teenage boys. Our court reporter Annika Smith filed this story.
Benjamin Swan, who's taught in Auckland schools for 30 years, is accused of abusing teenage boys, allegations he categorically denies. He's pleaded not guilty to 10 charges of doing an indecent act on a young person that relate to 6 different complainants. Yesterday, the jury heard from a boy who said Mr. Swan touched his penis while he was asleep. Today, that boy's girlfriend told the jury he confided in her afterwards. Her words have been voiced to protect her identity.
He said he woke up to see Swan touching his private parts, and he just pretended to sleep because he didn't know what to do. He was telling me he was crying. I didn't know what to do.
She said the boy struggled to tell her at first, going on to say he didn't think it would ever happen to him.
He said that it's disgusting, thinking of an older man just standing over you, touching you.
The boy later told his mother, which sparked a police investigation that identified other complainants. The Crown called its second complainant this afternoon. The jury watched a DVD interview with the boy, in which he says he was also touched by Mr. Swan. The teenager struggles to communicate at times throughout the interview, needing regular prompting from the interviewer for more detail about his story.
All I felt was his hand sweep under my shorts. He was just touching it. And do I have to actually say it?
The interviewer confirms she needs to know exactly what happened, after which the boy says Mr. Swan had masturbated him. Mr. Swan denies the accusations and has already signalled his intent to give evidence in his own defence. Yesterday, his defence lawyer Sam Wimsett said none of the boys had been touched, but Crown Prosecutor Chris Howard said this couldn't be possible, given the similarities of the boys' stories. The trial before Justice Moore and a jury of 6 women and 6 men is set down for 3 weeks. Ātui te ko ti matua ko Annika Smith-Aho.
You may remember the provocative Canadian speakers Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux. The High Court has previously upheld a decision to cancel their booking at the Bruce Mason Centre in 2018 for speaking events. Now the case has reached the Court of Appeal to consider whether the council overstepped the mark when it cancelled the event. Matthew Tunison's been in court.
Yesterday marked 2 years since hundreds of Aucklanders gathered in Aotea Square to protest giving the pair a platform, citing previous racist and other offensive comments. Now the case has found itself before 3 of the country's senior judges after an appeal by Dunedin bookseller Malcolm Moncrief Spittle and David Cuman, who's described as a prominent member of Auckland's Jewish community. Their lawyer, Jack Hodder QC, told Justices Cooper, Kosh and Courtney that the right to freedom of expression was denied when council-controlled Regional Facilities Auckland made a hasty decision to block the speakers.
We say the issue is whether a council-controlled organisation is exercising public powers when it is managing access to the public assets, i.e. the venues that exist for indoor cultural and political meetings.
Justice Kosh asked Mr. Hodder how far he was prepared to go to defend the right to freedom of speech and expression.
We're not quite at the level of a neo-Nazi organisation cheerfully booking the Bruce Mason Centre, but perhaps even then.
We would say even then, probably. Unless those who are organising and performing at the meeting were advocating something unlawful, then all the ordinary aspects of these debates come to bear.
He said the assertion that the event was cancelled due to fears for people's safety could not be stacked up.
It may well be that in the end, a valid decision could be made to say that it's impossible to provide security at the Bruce Mason Centre. We simply don't know because they didn't inquire at the time in the circumstances that they were there.
Another lawyer for the appellants, Jordan Grimmer, questioned the High Court judge's conclusion that they were acting out of self-interest rather than fulfilling the role of public watchdog.
And he also goes on to say that the applicants' conduct constituted something of a crusade against RFL. It seems to draw that inference from the fact that they had injected their self-interest into the decision. Now, it's fair to say the appellants resist this characterisation of their motives rather strongly.
As such, Mr. Grimmer argued they shouldn't have been hit with a $46,500 bill for court costs, as they were acting in the interests of the public. Lawyer for the Council and Regional Facilities Auckland, Catherine Anderson, argued that the artists, as Miss Southern and Mr. Molyneux were referred to in contract documents, couldn't be said to have been holding a public event, as claimed by the appellants.
The artists were to be paid a minimum of $60,000 each. So in this context, it's clearly a paid speaking engagement. It was not an event that was open to the public. So the references in the submissions for the appellants to this concept of town hall events and council or local authorities' traditional role in that way is in our submission a reference to an event of a very different character.
The hearing will continue tomorrow. In Auckland for Checkpoint, call Matthew Tunis and TNA.
The disgraced former minister Ian Lees-Galloway has returned to Parliament for the first time since his sacking to give his final farewell speech. The Palmerston North MP was last month stripped of his ministerial portfolios for having an affair with a staffer who worked directly with his office. He subsequently announced he would retire at the election, ending a 12-year political career. He told the House that 2 weeks ago he wasn't preparing to give his farewell speech, but is now ready and happy to go.
Mr. Speaker, I am leaving Parliament because I can no longer serve as a minister. And I can no longer serve as a minister because some of my actions have not been congruent with the expectations we should all have of ministers or anyone in a position of power or leadership. As Minister of Workplace Relations and Safety and as a leader in my office, it was not appropriate to have a private relationship with a staff member in a department that reported to me who worked directly with my office. We must recognise not only the imbalance of power involved, but also the impact such a relationship can have on a workplace. That's why I have to go. Anyone who thinks otherwise hasn't been paying attention. Just because it was tolerated in the past doesn't mean it ought to be in 2020. I apologise to my family. The trauma they have experienced has been excruciating. First, there was the trauma of our own private business. Then there was the dehumanising trauma of being used for headlines and clickbait by an industry that somehow thought it was appropriate to publish images of their house when they were at their most vulnerable. Every attack, every thoughtless and uninformed commentary cuts at the hearts of political families. We at least get to put our case. Our families don't. I am sorry for the hurt and humiliation I have inflicted on my family and for the direct impact of my actions on so many others. My family is incredible. They are tough cookies, overflowing with resilience, and we will come out of this stronger together.
And that was Ian Lees-Galloway giving his valedictory speech at Parliament. Truckies and local leaders are at breaking point over a dangerous highway between Napier and Taupo, where 8 people have been killed in the last 12 months. They say government ministers and Waka Kotahi, that's the transport agency, aren't listening to their pleas. Our Hawke's Bay reporter Tom Kitchen took a trip along State Highway 5.
Truck driver Tony Alexander has seen a fair few crashes, but in March, he was one of the first responders to a crash where a 21-year-old woman was killed. He describes the moment when he arrived at the site.
Essentially, it's just carnage. You've got 2 cars that are sitting in the middle of the road, one that's got so much impact damage to it that you just know that it's not going to be a good outcome. And, you've got people that are trying to help, you've got people that are just standing around not knowing what to do. And it's chaos at the start.
Mr. Alexander has been calling on Waka Kotahi to change their tune for months, but he says they haven't properly addressed his concerns.
Is it the workmanship? Is it the fact that they're not using the proper materials? Is it the funding? We don't know. We're the ones that are out here on the road and see this damage, and we can't do anything about it.
Hastings Mayor Sandra Hazelhurst agrees with Mr. Alexander. She's been getting call after call almost every day from residents and is sick of people losing their lives on the road. But she says no significant change has been guaranteed by central government.
While there has been a small investment in this road over the last year or so, it's not sufficient, and it is just replacing what is there and filling in. There isn't any serious improvements made to the road that are going to make significant safety changes.
Road Transport Forum Chief Executive Nick Leggett has joined forces with the locals for the fight. He says the road service is like a patchwork quilt, and as you drive along you can see why there are so many accidents.
8 fatalities in 12 months is an appalling record of road safety, and this road to us is a local and regional example of a national problem.
He put a challenge to Associate Minister of Transport Julianne Genter, who's responsible for road safety.
What is the response from politicians when they've got a road like this that's a major carrier of people and freight, and 8 people have been killed in the last year. Surely there has to be some response. And as I've said, I think that Julian Genter needs to come to the Hawke's Bay and see this for herself.
Ms Genter was unavailable for an interview with RNZ. While not directly addressing Mr Leggett's comments, in a statement she says she expects Waka Kotahi to prioritise safety upgrades to the most dangerous roads. She says safety upgrades like sided median crash barriers and rumble strips will be rolled out across the 3,000 kilometres of high-risk state highways over Aotearoa. Waka Kotahi wouldn't be interviewed either, but its regional transport systems boss Oliver Postings says the agency recognises residents' concerns. It plans to analyse the road a bit more to see if there are any specific issues or areas that require immediate attention. But many locals in the Hastings district feel it's just a matter of time before the next life is claimed on this stretch of road. For Checkpoint, call Tom Kitchenaho.
And some quick feedback before the 6 o'clock news on our interview with the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield. This listener says level 4 will not work next time here. This is if we get community transmission again of COVID. They say they won't get the same buy-in.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātawa tēnei. The Auditor General wants much greater transparency about how the $3 billion Provincial Growth Fund is being spent. John Ryan told Checkpoint there is some reporting of money that has been given out to different projects, but it's difficult to tell how many jobs have been created and whether they meet the fund's requirements. He can't yet tell whether it is value for money.
What we're expecting at this stage is to be able to see all the projects that were funded, what was expected of each of those projects and what's been achieved against that expectation. But ultimately, what we need to know is whether there's value for money in $3 billion of public spending, and the plan needs to be in place to evaluate that now.
The Auditor General, John Ryan, about $500 million from the fund has actually been spent. The government's putting pressure on local councils to accept its money to fix New Zealand's 3 waters problem. Today, the Minister for Local Government, Nānaia Mahuta, announced the share of $761 million between regions for drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. Tom Kitchen reports.
However, councils will have to sign a memorandum of understanding by the end of this month if they want to get the cash. Each regional group would then have until September the 30th to divide the funds up among them. Canterbury will get the most money at $100 million. The Gisborne region's set to get $11 million, the least of all. But Auckland's funding still hasn't been announced. The government says it's still considering the package for our biggest city. This is Tom Kitchen.
The disgraced former Minister Ian Lees-Galloway says his affair with a former staffer left him with no choice but to leave politics. The Palmerston North MP has returned to Parliament for the first time since his sacking to give his final farewell speech in the debating chamber. Mr Lees-Galloway is retiring at the election after being stripped of his ministerial portfolios for having a relationship with someone who worked directly with his office. He told the House that some of his behaviour has not met expectations.
We must recognise not only the imbalance of power involved, but also the impact such a relationship can have on a workplace. That's why I have to go. Anyone who thinks otherwise hasn't been paying attention. Just because it was tolerated in the past doesn't mean it ought to be in 2020.
Palmerston North MP Ian Lees-Galloway. The Director General of Health has admitted the ministry is falling well short of its COVID-19 testing targets. Just over 1,600 people tested for the coronavirus yesterday. Ashley Bloomfield says he'd like to see the number of daily tests closer to the 4,000 mark.
We do know the numbers in the community has been low. We know people have been declining testing, and that's why we really have put a focused effort on that. And we've seen those numbers start to increase over the last week or two. We're wanting them to go higher.
Ashley Bloomfield speaking to Checkpoint. Hundreds of Queenstown Lakes District residents have been tested for COVID-19 after a traveller visited, then tested positive in South Korea. Well South Primary Health Network set up a free drive-through testing site at the Pack and Save car park in Frankton. They prepared 400 tests for the day, but by mid-morning had to get another 500 to cope with the demand. Queenstown resident Yannick says he wants to keep his community safe. He says people should get tested to ensure there is no community transmission. The police have charged and arrested 2 people over the death of Southland man Dale Watene. The 40-year-old's body was discovered in a forest near to Invercargill in May this year. A 30-year-old woman has been charged with murder and a 23-year-old man with accessory after the fact to murder. They were due to appear in Invercargill District Court today. Police say they're not looking for anyone else in relation to the matter. The Police National Dive Squad has found a body in the Whanganui River. A search began today after police had a call early this morning about a distressed man seen in the water next to Anzac Parade. The body was found about 4:30 this afternoon and will now be formally identified. It's 4 minutes past 6. The Warriors interim coach Todd Payton says the NRL side's next head coach will join a team with a solid foundation for success. Payton, who took over when Stephen Kearney was sacked 6 weeks ago, has turned down the club's offer to take the job full-time. The former NRL forward wants to remain in Australia long-term for family reasons and has set his sights on coaching the Cowboys. With 1 year left on his contract as an assistant coach with the Warriors, Payton says just a few changes are needed to make the club successful.
It's a great club. It's full of good people. The playing roster itself, they're really respectful. They want to learn. They're a group that are hungry to get better. There are a couple of changes I think we can make to personnel which would improve the squad as such, but the next coach coming in there, he'll have a playing group and ready to roll their sleeves up and ready to learn.
Warriors Chief Executive Cameron George says they won't be rushed into an appointment to replace Kearney. Meanwhile, Bulldogs players are welcoming the club's attempts to sign Sonny Bill Williams for the 2021 season. The Crosscode star is back at the Roosters as a late-season replacement and is likely to be a free agent next year. The Breakers basketball team have landed a big name with their latest signing for the looming Australian NBL. Former NBA small forward Lamar Patterson will switch from the Brisbane Bullets to join the New Zealand side on a one-season deal. The 28-year-old American will arrive in Auckland in early October. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, there's a Writers' Festival discussion with Chris McDowell, author of the marvellous new New Zealand Atlas, We Are Here. Trevor Reiki speaks to ethnomusicologist Lloyd Miller about his love for Oriental jazz. And I have a few questions for our transitional engineer, Susan Crumdiek, like when we really need to be getting off that fossil fuel wagon, why is it harder than ever to take the bus or train around Aotearoa? On Nights from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Gisborne long fine spells. Isolated showers mainly in the east. Auckland to Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Central High Country, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Mainly fine. Areas of evening and morning fog. Cloud gradually increasing tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast and Wellington, cloudy periods. Patchy drizzle tonight and tomorrow morning. Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury and Otago mainly fine with high cloud. However, areas of low cloud or fog develop tomorrow. For Bulla, mostly cloudy with a few showers. Westland and Fiordland, occasional rain clearing from Fiordland tomorrow. Southland, mostly cloudy, patchy rain developing, clearing by tomorrow morning. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes, almost 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. An independent report into the Provincial Growth Fund has found there's a lack of transparency and accountability when it comes to some spending, despite recent reporting improvements. The report by the Auditor General's Office raises concerns about how some of the $3 billion has been allocated and the establishment of a so-called fund within a fund that seemed to have different criteria applied to it. It also found some projects had been tagged for funding before due diligence was complete, and it was difficult to assess the value of the jobs created. The report says evaluation is critical given the fund's ambition, size and profile, and the public is entitled to know how well the PGF has met its objectives and what benefits it's delivered. Well, joining me now is the Minister in charge of the PGF, Shane Jones. Good evening, Minister. There is some, serious criticism there. What is your response to it?
Well, I think the Auditor General is just identifying how MB can tighten up its processes. I think it's a very useful contribution that we bring a bit more robustness to the evaluation, because that can't happen because the majority of the projects of the large scale haven't even started.
So do you accept all the findings of the report?
Well, look, I don't want to cavil in public with the Auditor General. He was kind enough to come and see me early this morning to give me a heads up. And really, I think the attention that he's bringing to the administration of the fund relate to the processes and the procedures that MB have followed.
How are we supposed to know as taxpayers whether this fund is delivering value for money in an independent way with some surety, given that you haven't or aren't meeting the benchmarks for transparency?
Well, the transparency obligation really lies in the bowels of the bureaucracy. Any question that I've sought to answer, I think I've acquitted myself quite well, actually. But on the question, which is really what you're asking, when will we know what has been the well-being benefit to society for the $3 billion fund? What is not often adequately appreciated is that a lot of the projects are long-term, such as the $500 million that was allocated towards the billion tree strategy. So it's only over a longer period of time as those forests develop that would get a full indication as to how it's turned around the fortunes of climate change, employment or local industry.
The Auditor General, though, says there should be progress reports in essence, but there's a lack of performance measures against the criteria for the funding. There doesn't seem to be a significant public reporting. There's no information about the quality of jobs created. And, well, in the mention there of some projects being funded without proper due diligence, don't you leave yourself open to criticism for not sorting out those things?
Well, I don't know what projects the Auditor General is referring to that were not subject to analysis. There was a project that came via the coalition agreement that was the establishment of the Māori Battalion Museum up there in Waitangi. I think really...
So, Minister, sorry to interrupt you, but it is a critical point in the report. Are you not aware of any projects that were given funding in principle prior to due diligence being carried out?
Well, no, I just gave you that answer. I said in the coalition agreement we said we were going to fund...
So there's only one, as far as you know?
Well, we also put dough into some synthetic race courses. There was something down in Dunedin. There was a sports centre called Te Ahu in Kaitaia. Now, all of these things were carried out with the mandate of the ministers.
Does that excuse the lack of transparency, though?
Well, no, I don't think it's fair to say that there's no transparency. Those projects have all been announced. And the Maori Battalion Museum is one of the most successful projects, and it's met with widespread acclamation.
But I suppose the devil is in the detail, and it is about assessing the expenditure against the goals and criteria for the fund. For example, one of the principal aims, as you will know, is to create high-quality, sustainable jobs. So of the 13-odd thousand jobs that you have said people are employed in at the PGF, how many of those are high quality? And how long have they lasted?
Yeah, so just on that point, you and I are coming at this from a different perspective. When we created the jobs to deliver the infrastructure outcomes, many of which have yet to take place, then other jobs will flow after the infrastructure has been developed, whether it's a wharf, whether it's a breakwater, whether it's a road, whether it's revamping Kiwi Rail. So obviously, when those projects, largely infrastructure being delivered, it does absorb people into those projects, and then those people move on to other projects, other infrastructure projects, and then investors follow up, and then they put their own money into different initiatives, and then they go and look for people. That's how economics works.
Understand it's not a stagnant thing, but what I'm asking you is what assessment have you done of the quality of jobs that have been created here? Because principally this is to create high quality, sustainable jobs. So what assessment have you done as to whether projects have met that criteria, high quality, sustainable jobs?
Yes, so there are multiple objectives to the Provincial Growth Fund: environmental resilience, inclusiveness, jobs, and indeed productivity. So jobs are a key feature, but also in terms of long-term productivity challenges, it's the infrastructure as well. If I take, for example, the $70 million that Cabinet allocated via the fund to water storage to bring forward the greater productivity outcomes associated with either stranded land assets owned by Māori or just general land.
So on the
over
subject of
time-
quality
over
of
time, those
jobs,
things
Minister,
get improved.
on the subject
Yes.
of quality of jobs, have you got any information or assessment of whether these jobs are of high quality and are sustainable?
Yes, I'll just repeat again. We've had 13,000 responses in the sense that these are the number of jobs that came to pass as a consequence of the $700 million that's already been allocated into the regions, into the enterprises. And those jobs are with firms that sell services, train people, and develop assets such as the infrastructure which we've funded. Those jobs are also within local government. Those jobs are within the firms that are planting the trees. Those jobs are in the firms that are going to build the breakwater and build the Opotiki Wharf.
Understand that. Let's move on then. Auditor General has raised concerns about the $70 million of the PGF fund that was set aside to meet manifesto commitments. The report says it wasn't clear exactly what measures you were using to evaluate those projects or whether they were the same measures used for other applications under the fund generally. Are you using a different criteria for projects approved under that ring-fenced fund?
Well, obviously, a number of those projects, such as the one I just referred to, came at the formation of the government, as indeed does KiwiRail. KiwiRail came to the pūtea going to KiwiRail was clearly linked to the desire of the parties forming our government to recapitalise KiwiRail. And a substantial amount of the money, hundreds of millions, came out of the Provincial Growth Fund. So it's incorrect to say that there was either no mandate or that it followed a process that wasn't exactly the same as funding $1 billion for a relatively small
So you
project,
have been using different criteria, Minister, for projects funded out of that manifesto commitments fund?
No. I think you're misconstruing what I'm saying. When we formed the government, we said that we'd use the Provincial Growth Fund to revamp KiwiRail, recapitalise some of the roads through NZTA. Those organisations have their own criterion. I'm not in charge of that criterion. That's in other parts of government. And we allocated that funding to other parts of government to deliver on the governmental outcomes we were elected to achieve.
The report says it was difficult to find evidence of how those projects had fully met the normal criteria for the fund. Why was that?
Well, look, I haven't seen specifically the reference you're referring to, but obviously I don't accept that. I think that the Provincial Growth Fund investment in the Maori Battalion Museum, the racetracks, the KiwiRail, it speaks for itself. They've been incredibly successful.
Appreciate you joining us this evening. That is Shane Jones, who is the Minister in charge of the PGF, and that's in response to a report from the Auditor General saying, well, there could be some improvements in transparency and accountability around the spending of that fund. It is almost 17 minutes after 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. At least 1,000 people have queued up for a COVID test in Queenstown today after a recent visitor tested positive in South Korea. Well South organised a temporary drive-through testing site at the Pack and Save car park in Frankton today to check for any sign of community transmission. Our reporter Tess Brunton spoke to those in the queue about why they're getting tested.
People started lining up for a test about 40 minutes before the temporary testing site was due to open at 9 a.m. Queenstown residents Ross and Rose were first in line.
Well, we feel it's better to be safe than sorry. This pop-up testing opportunity is here today, so we decided to take it.
Both are in their 70s.
We're in a very vulnerable group and we felt it's essential to come and look. It's all here for us. They couldn't have made it easier. It seems beautifully, perfectly organised, and we're very impressed.
Organisers Well South started testing before 9 as cars kept joining the 3-lane queues and people walked in for tests. The team is made up of 30 to 40 people with 12 swabbers. By 9:30, 100 people had been swabbed. One of them is Greg, who works at a ski field near Queenstown.
If there's anyone in Queenstown that's likely to come in contact with someone, it's one of our lovely ski field workers. We're up there, we're interacting with the public, we're giving smiles, high fives, We're helping them up off the ground, and we see people from all over New Zealand.
He doesn't believe New Zealand has seen the end of COVID-19 outbreaks yet.
Our borders are still porous. We've got flight crews coming in and out. It is only a matter of time until this gets into the country, and we as a society need to be prepared for that.
Queenstown resident Jeff was waiting in line for 15 minutes and says he expected the queues.
People want to do the right thing, but they should have had far more booths. And so it's a bit ridiculous having to wait this long.
Wells South Primary Health Network started out with 400 tests prepared for the day, but had to get 500 more to cope with the demand. They tested 400 people before midday. Its medical director, Stephen Graham, says they weren't sure how many people would show up. He says they want to prevent similar outbreaks to what's happening in Victoria.
In these places, there's been low levels in the community for a period of time, and then it gets out of control by the time you find it. There's a whole lot more cases, so we're trying to test now and pick it up if it's there before it becomes more widespread.
Queenstown residents William and Derna both work at one of the businesses the traveller visited. They were happy to get it over and done with.
It sucked. It sucked, but it's not like a terrible thing that's going to end your life. Honestly, like that's all I can say.
It's just really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's all.
And then it was my turn, as nurses Jess and Sarah gave me a COVID-19 test with a swab that looks a bit like a long flossing brush.
So it's a swab that goes up one nostril. It's uncomfortable but not painful, so it'll be all over in a few seconds. Your job's just to hold your head really nice and still. Just breathe away normally and just keep breathing. It's just a few seconds.
Okay.
And just keep breathing.
I've got a swab up my nose. It is moving around. It's, what would you say?
All done.
Not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Here's a wee tissue.
Thank you. I will need that for my eyes. Uncomfortable, but not painful. There's also an option to get a blood sample to check if people have been exposed or have previously had COVID. Angela got both tests done and says they wouldn't be testing if it wasn't necessary.
Less invasive than I thought. It was quite a skinny little, or thinner than a Q-tip, and it just sort of prickled a little bit, but it didn't hurt, and it certainly you didn't feel sick having it done or anything. It was quite painless.
Dr. Stephen Graham says the more testing they can do, the better. Most people can expect their results over the coming days. In Queenstown for Checkpoint, Ko Tasbrunton, TNA.
A government initiative to help fruit and veggie growers while also feeding hungry whānau is coming to an end. But food banks say demand for the service is only growing. The Agriculture Minister today announced $500,000 to fund trials aimed at reducing food waste and addressing food insecurity. But a food rescue charity says there also needs to be money to help buy fresh produce for hungry families, boosting growers and those doing it tough. Our cameraman Nick Munro and reporter Nita Blake-Person filed this report.
Crisp carrots, fresh kiwi fruit and giant celery stalks, an abundance of fruit and vegetables fill boxes at this Auckland warehouse. It's headed to hungry families as part of a government initiative connecting growers with those who've been hardest hit by COVID's economic impact.
There was a gap there during a period of time when there was an excess of fresh fruit and vegetables available. That very quickly was repurposed in terms of providing these boxes, and we saw during, I think, at the end of level 4, we still saw community groups that were desperate for fresh fruit and vegetables, and with MPI's direction and funding, we ended up through our United Fresh organisation providing 10,000 boxes a week, which initially started off for I think a 10-week period. That got extended to a 14-week period, and here we are today, just coming to the end of that period with these boxes for community groups.
Jerry Prendergast is the Chief Executive of United Fresh, a group representing the fresh produce industry. They stepped in when greengrocers had to close during lockdown and made sure their kai didn't go to waste. They were given $3.7 million to fill 100,000 boxes over the past 12 weeks, supplying food banks, marae, Salvation Armies and community groups.
We fixed a problem for our growers because we found a home for the product, so the waste was not in the marketplace. We actually resolved the problem for some of those community groups that were desperate for fresh fruit and vegetables during that period. Our delight through this process has been hearing feedback that they had not experienced fresh produce the way it's been coming to them.
While many other food banks supply cans and vital non-perishables, fresh food is often harder to come by. But Jerry Prendergast says the funding for this initiative is coming to an end.
Disappointed, really. The 12 to 14-week period has come to an end. We'd like to see Ministry look at continuing this project. We think there's an opportunity for those community groups to actually continue with this produce. We also know that while we're changing people's palates in terms of eating, that you're actually reducing the salts, fats and sugars, and that's only got to be good for those groups.
Speaking at the food rescue charity Fair Food today, Agriculture Minister Damien O'Connor announced funding of $100,000 to fund trials for 5 new initiatives to address food insecurity and waste.
These 5 organisations have come up with innovative projects and we're going to support them. It's $100,000 each to grow what is a good idea and I'm sure will probably become mainstream operations. So we're very mindful of this challenge. This new area of acute food need is something that we've been confronted with through post-COVID and we have to work on a solution.
But United Fresh's produce plan isn't on today's funding list. Veronica Shale is the chief executive here at Fair Food and she says it's been a massive help having them over the past few months.
When COVID hit, the supply chain wasn't able to reliably deliver what we kind of give our communities. And so to have this constant supply has just been an absolute lifesaver and a game changer for a lot of people. Last year we were helping feed about 3,000 people a week. This year, each week it's about 20,000 people are fed, we help feed them. That's a significant leap.
Damien O'Connor says the United Fresh initiative was about addressing a short-term critical issue and longer-term solutions are now needed. But he's not ruling out bringing it back in the future.
We'll continue discussions with United Fresh. They've done a great job with fruit in schools, for a long time. But there are other organisations like this one that's popped up. So we'll work with all of these agencies, making sure that if they have identified a real gap and a need in the community, that we can help them fill that.
Today's funding is part of the nearly $15 million the government has budgeted over the next 2 years to save food from the primary sector that would otherwise be wasted. Efforts to create greater food security in a time where so many things are far from certain. Mo te hotaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blake person ahau.
Peter Gus Soakula might be playing in a losing team, but the 25-year-old Chiefs number 8 is stamping his mark on Super Rugby Aotearoa and has his eyes on an All Blacks prize. The Chiefs are winless in 6 games and will need a big performance if they're to upset the competition-leading Crusaders in Hamilton on Saturday night. Fiji-born and raised, Soakula came into rugby less directly than many of his peers, and he was in New Zealand chasing another sporting dream long before he became a chief. Rugby reporter Joe Porter has more.
Now Soakula on the wraparound. Peter Gus Soakula fending them away and he's there.
Peter Gus Soakula has made the back of the Chiefs scrum his own and assistant coach Neil Barnes is excited about his prospects.
He's got a very good ball carry, which you expect from a lot of Fijians, but he has a point of difference in the fact that he's also a big defender, works hard, and defends going forward and back. If anyone makes line breaks, he's one person that works really hard to get back. It's his ability to keep running and defend.
However, it was on the basketball court rather than the rugby field where Soakula got his first big break. He was picked in the Fiji national team as a teenager and ended up playing for Otago in 2014.
Yeah, it was fun meeting up with those big basketball players as well, and watching the packed stadium down at Dunners every weekend.
At 6'5" and 110 kilograms, it's not surprising he's good at basketball, but it's not just Soakula's physical size that Chiefs first 5 Aaron Cruden covets.
Oh, you've got to love a good moustache, don't you? Being a guy who can't really grow facial hair all that well, you sort of look at people like that with a little bit of jealousy.
Soakula would later be selected in the Fiji Rugby Sevens squad, but opted to chase his hoop dreams instead, winning silver with the Fiji basketball team at the 2015 Pacific Games.
I was in both the Sevens squad as well at the same year for basketball and Sevens, so I just chose basketball because they offered me a scholarship there, which I was supposed to go to.
That scholarship was at Iowa Central Community College, but fell through at the last minute. That's when Soakula decided to focus on rugby, and he ended up at the Taranaki Academy in 2016, where he was moved out of the forwards and onto the wing.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. And sometimes because wingers just stay on the side and waiting for the ball, especially the weather. It was a challenge for me. First time playing rugby in the cold.
Soil-Kula wasn't left freezing out wide for long and was soon back among the Lucies, where he's been impressing with the Chiefs, though he didn't always want to be a number 8, with his favourite player, a former All Black first 5.
My friend was like Dan Carter, because he's left-hand kicker, so I love kicking as well. I'll pretty much say, I was like, I'll be Dan Carter.
Soil-Kula, who writes mum and family on his wrist strapping, is confident he could nail an in-game clearing kick, and Chiefs forwards coach Barnes shares that belief. He tells me that he has quite a good left boot himself. Have you seen that?
Not heaps, no, but I've got no doubt he can do it.
I asked him if he would ever bust it out during a Super Rugby game, and he was a bit gun-shy. I thought he might get told off.
It's very unlike his forward coach to ever tell him off.
And Barnes has been a welcome recipient of some famous Fijian hospitality.
He did serve us up at Carver night after the Crusaders game, which was well received by the boys.
It seems to be a bit of a Chiefs tradition, actually, that. Liam Messam, I think, maybe was part of the initial crew that got into that.
Yeah, he never invited me to his sessions, though.
Soil-Kula made himself unavailable for Fiji at last year's World Cup, signalling his intentions to seek All Black selection.
If New Zealand offers, then I'll probably take that. That's the betterment for my game and also my family.
And if that wasn't to eventuate, you'd obviously love to represent Fiji?
Yes, I would love that. And back on my mind, I would love to go back and play for Fiji one day.
If he continues to be a shining light in a tough season for the Chiefs, Soil-Kula's international debut might come sooner rather than later. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko Joe Porter aho.
And some feedback on the Provincial Growth Fund from you. This person says, I wonder if the AG had delivered a glowing report on the PGF, would Minister Jones be deflecting all the praise to MB? Another listener says, we live in Whangarei and my partner is working on a Provincial Growth Fund project. It has put his hours back up to 100% and has been a lifeline for his company. There's so much good come out of it, she says. Back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Auditor General says it's difficult to track the progress of the $3 billion Provincial Growth Fund. The agri-chemicals company Corteva has confirmed it will close its manufacturing operations in New Plymouth. Local councils will have to sign a memorandum of understanding by the end of this month if they want to get their share of $761 million to fix New Zealand's 3 waters problems. And the government's putting $500,000 into 5 projects aimed at addressing food insecurity and reducing wastage. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7, then it's Nights with Brian Crump. Right now, it's the Trending Now half hour, our feature where we normally highlight the stories you've been sharing via digital and social media. Before 7, we'll have our report from Parliament, the House. But because of timing constraints this evening, we're going straight to today's edition of The Detail.
A couple of weeks ago, a big story emerged from World